Good afternoon and welcome to the IISS. I'm Virginia Comolli, Senior Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development. Welcome to the fifth installment of our monthly IISS Conflict Briefing. So every month we zoom in on a given conflict, making use of the data and analysis that is contained in our armed conflict database, and also taking advantage of our in-house expertise. In fact, today we have with us my colleagues Andrew Tchie, who's our research fellow, and also the editor of the Armed Conflict Database. And we also have Eleanor Beevor, who is our research analyst and is the person as our in-house expert on DRC, and she follows it very closely for the Armed Conflict Database. And between the two of them have bags of experience, field work experience, and really lots of experience working in conflict-affected regions across the African continent. Today's session is on the record, and we also have people joining us via webinar. So there will be also probably some questions or comments from people joining us from afar. The conflict in the DRC is a rather active one, as you can see from the incidents that are displayed at the back here, and has also been making headlines in recent weeks owing to the rather controversial December elections. So today we have the opportunity to get a better sense of what is going on, and also we'll give you the opportunity to ask our experts what you would like to know about the conflict. I'll first start with Eleanor. The conflict in the DRC is a very complex one. There are multiple actors involved. Can you please just give us a sense of where we are and help us understand the patterns of violence in the DRC?
I'll do my best. Thank you. As you say, the conflict in the DRC is so complex that it more or less defies wholesale comprehension, given how many microdynamics at the local level affect patterns of violence. Over the past 5 years, we've seen the gradual decline of large-scale, externally or regionally backed armed actors such as the M23 or their forerunner, the CNDP. And in their place, we've seen a massive proliferation of much smaller non-state armed groups. There's now, to the point that there's now likely well over 100. A huge majority among those groups are what is known as, or can be classified as, Mai groups. These are a sort of hybrid between a local defence militia or vigilante group and a larger scale rebel group. They're very often quite small, less than 200 fighters. However, they can sometimes be larger, and they can also group into larger coalitions. So, for example, the Mai Mai Mazembe in North Kivu, or Mai Mai Nyakatumba in South Kivu. And they've also spawned similar franchise organisations such as the Raya Mutumboki. There are, naturally, when you have that many actors and that many agendas, there's much more potential for spoilers, which is what is just a part of what makes this conflict so exceptionally complicated. But there's several other key drivers in that complexity. And one key issue is that of citizenship. So a majority of these Mai groups style themselves as protectors of their personal ethnic community against so-called immigrants or invaders, who are very often believed to be of Rwandan origin, the so-called Banyarwanda. This is a legacy of Belgian colonialism. Belgians effectively excluded Rwandaphone speakers on the grounds that they didn't believe that they were indigenous to what was then the Belgian Congo. And so their Rwandaphones' involvement in their political representation and land ownership was extremely minor. And over time, this view has crystallised, leading to a great tension between Rwandaphone ethnic groups and non-Rwandaphone ethnic groups who see themselves as the indigenes and Rwandaphones as invaders, immigrants, etc. That tension very often verged on violence, but it was after the massive influx of Rwandan refugees in the wake of the genocide of 1994 into Eastern Congo, with militants among them, that this citizenship-based violence really took off. And that view has also continued to be very cynically exploited by politicians wanting to curry favour with non-Rwandaphone groups. That said, its ethnic divisions are not just along Rwandaphone and non-Rwandaphone lines. When armed groups infringe on land that is, in theory, owned by customary authorities, that creates further tensions as well, and these have become gradually militarised over time. I think another key factor that we have to emphasise when looking at this conflict is the short-termism of so many of the actors involved. They are all struggling to survive in an extremely violent and extremely competitive environment. And so whilst each militant group has its own agenda, its own objectives, its own ideology, those ideologies are very flexible, if not expendable in the short term, if there is an advantageous alliance to be made. And one of the keenest actors in temporarily co-opting these armed groups is the Congolese Army itself, the FARDC. The FARDC is militarily weak. It was formed after the Second Congo War from a hodgepodge of armed actors. And that means it's suffered defeats against lesser equipped rebel groups than itself because of this disunity. So it's very often relied on militant groups to fight its battles for it. And it has also taken advantage of those militant groups to take out political opposition or to be able to exploit valuable resources. And obviously there are very often political elites at the top of that chain of command. So this is just a snapshot of some of the reasons why the DRC violence, particularly in the east, is as complicated as it is. But I hope we can answer some more questions about that later. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's turn to the elections. Andrew, can you please help us make a sense of what's going on?
So, elections, I mean, that's a very complex and loaded question, but I'll do my best, and just obviously apologies for some of the people in the room where I might repeat stuff that's already out there. We know that the elections was not free and fair. We know that almost 1.5 million weren't allowed to vote. In addition, we know that Senko, who is the obviously coalition of churches, has said that in many cases it wasn't that the results that were currently produced were not fair or were not reflective of the sort of votes that they collected, or sorry, should I say, the actual count that they took. We also know that in many cases that the reason why Felix Tshisekedi was nominated or seen as nominated to the presidency was because he's seen as somebody who would not provoke the actual current regime. This is something that was confirmed to me very early on, from almost the 21st of November, that there were talks going on from senior officials that I was speaking to, that actually one of the reasons why the elections was pushed back was for these negotiations for them to agree on the, sort of what the outcomes of the elections were going to be beforehand. That being said, what we have seen over the last few days is SADC come out and obviously say that there needs to be a recount. We've then seen the Zambian foreign minister say actually what the chair has said is not actually correct, and he didn't mean in this context. We then see today that SADC and the African Union have said that they're going to hold emergency talks about the issue. So what we see in DRC is, what I see is no real resolution. And we'll get to some of the sort of deep finer details later on, but I don't see any sort of resolution going forward, certainly when it comes to any of the sides. One of the things that I was observing throughout the election process is that none of the leaders really were able to bring the people of the DRC together. Even when the coalition was struck in Geneva, literally the day after, these people are fragmented, and there's a new coalition formed within that coalition. What this does is pretty much divide the country into two. So you have the sort of Martin Fayulu and his team on the western side, and then you have obviously Felix from the central, and Vital Kamerhe on the eastern side as well. Just another comment on sort of the UN. So what we see with the UN Security Council as well, which is really interesting, is South Africa actually joining forces with China and Russia. That's something that very peculiar and something that I'm not really sure why it happened. I guess maybe possibly linked to potential elections that are coming later on in the year, but that's something that it wasn't expected for us. It's something that a lot of us were thrown back by. Just another sort of two other areas to talk about, which was the election. So we know the election process wasn't handled well. We know that in many places people weren't able to vote, as I've said before. We know that the election process was badly communicated, and on top of that, we know that obviously deals were cut with members of the FCC as well, which is the ruling coalition as well. Logistically, it was a nightmare, and also I think one of the downfalls of the elections from Sini's point, which is the Electoral Commission's perspective, was to pretty much put together the presidential and the three other various elections together into one, which I think would have caused confusion. But also on top of that, having these people then use iPads or sort of electronic devices during the elections didn't really help the process as well. The other thing just to touch on was the leaders themselves, and I'll give you some sort of breakdown on the scenarios of what we've been assessing. So, as I said earlier, the leaders were not really in coalition. We're not really working together, talking together, and really trying to bring the country together in a sort of national unity or dialogue. Many of the leaders relied on their sort of ethnic political device, or where they're from, in essence, to really get those votes, and that's something that I foresee going forward. I definitely think in the DRC you're going to see that trend going forward. I don't see that diminishing anytime soon. It is also important to note, and this is different from what is currently being put out there, is that Martin Fayulu had called for a boycott, had called the machines or the electronic devices cheating machines, and to a degree that hasn't supported what I'll talk about later on, is the sort of constitutional court's potential ruling. And I think that's something that I think will be used against him later on as well. Just to sort of wrap up quickly on those points, the other thing is to remember that the FCC, and which is something that, I mean, the world at large, or the international community, is focused mostly on Kabila resigning, and actually has neglected the National Assembly. And this is where it's key, because the National Assembly has over 350 members, and obviously 350 out of 500, and this is really where the power is. And so even if Martin Fayulu becomes the head, or it's Felix Tshisekedi, or it's Kabila, whoever is in charge, it's the National Assembly that matters, that really makes the policy, and that's what's key going forward. The other thing just to touch on is also that within any of these sort of elections and these processes, is the military and the elites run the country, and that's something that I think in most of the reporting that I've seen, or the breakdown of analysis, that people haven't touched on, that actually what is important in the DRC is how the elites are supported, or to a degree how they're cozied up to, and how the army receive what they need, or receive what they see as rightfully theirs as well.
Thank you. And if I could just push you a little further to look into the future, what do you think are the most likely scenarios, and what are the top challenges that the country is going to face in the coming weeks and months?
So I think there are three scenarios that I foresee going forward in the DRC. The first being the Constitutional Court rejects the results, which means that Sini is then forced to cancel the election results, which means that Kabila remains in power. This could trigger violence within the central region, particularly because that's where Felix Tshisekedi comes from. But also that would then mean that the Constitutional Court could trigger Article 70 and 76. I'm particularly worried about 76 because that article allows Kabila to remain in power up to, I think, almost 5 months, in addition to however long he's been in beforehand. The second scenario, which is, I think, probably more likely to happen, is the Constitutional Court rejects Martin Fayulu's appeal, and this is, I believe this will happen because 6 of the 12 nominees, or so to say the Constitutional Court members or judges in this case, were nominated by Kabila. On top of that, 9 of them were on the side of Kabila, and on top of that, 3 are supposed to be independent. As they say. So again, when that appeal goes through, it's highly unlikely that it will be accepted. But let's see. I mean, this is DRC, so anything can happen. And I think this sort of conclusion from that will be, no matter what the international community says, or the African Union or SADC says, we might have to accept those results. And then sort of the third scenario, which is I think what the African Union and SADC are pushing for, is that we see some demonstrations throughout parts of the country, not as violent as we saw in 2017 and 18. Some protests, obviously depending on wherever the Constitutional Court rules in, a potential word of government of unity, but I don't think the government of unity will hold, again, because the coalition's already fallen apart. And if the government of unity does go forward, again, as I said, because of the Geneva agreement and it falling apart a day after, I think what it does is, if a coalition does happen, it means that the FCC will be able to reinforce its power by bringing in more people as part of that coalition within this National Assembly. And so, for me, I don't see that third option as likely, but again, this is DRC politics and anything can happen. And so sort of the 5 things I would say that the next president leader would need to deal with going forward is, first I would say definitely poor governance. We see that throughout DRC at both the local level and the national level. The second, I think, is general security and the emergence of armed groups. Now, obviously, Eleanor's spoken on that. I think this is key because it impacts the UN Security Council, but also the UN mission itself in DRC. It means that, whether the DRC, the mission itself is extended or shortened, really hinges on this sort of security element within the DRC. The third element, I think, is the redistribution of land, economic development within the country, and the intercommunal violence that we see. This is something that, particularly in the east, is on the rise, in the central parts and the northern parts as well. The fourth part, which really links back to the ethnic divides that you see within the DRC, but also links particularly to the way in which elections were held, is the ethnic political divides that you see within DRC. Again, I see those tensions increasing. It's likely that we might see at the local level more fragmentations amongst the local groups, and that increasing the potential for localized violence to continue. And then the fifth point, which I think everyone knows about, is the sort of Ebola crisis. And I think that is a concern because it looks like it's something that might be more permanent. There doesn't seem to be any real effort to deal with that. I mean, it's very tricky given the regional location, but I think that's something that will impact, particularly because it's in a conflict zone as well.
Oh. A very complex picture. You made reference to a number of armed groups, and of course Eleanor has also spoken about them, especially the Mai Mai. They tend to be the ones that make headlines more often, but there are multiple other groups, large groups, whose action have a substantial political impact. So which one are the most troublesome, the ones to watch out for, Eleanor?
Sure. So we'd be here all day if we tried to go over them all, but I'm going to highlight a few that I think were formative in creating the current political climate. So as you can see here, as you all know, it's the Kivu provinces have been the sort of hot zone of the activity. However, we have some violence scattered around the country. This is based from our 2018 monitoring on the armed conflict database. And in this map, you can see the sort of activity zones where we've recorded some of the groups that I'm going to mention now. So I'll start with one of the oldest and most enduring, which is the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, or the FDLR. So this is a Hutu militia, elements of which are believed to have been involved in the Rwandan genocide. The FDLR has been targeted by a lot of military operations over the years, so it's now a lot smaller than it was. It's about 600 to 700 fighters, according to UN estimates. And its future as a rebel group is looking stunted in many ways. It hasn't got much purpose at the moment. It can't, with the numbers that it has, it cannot take on Paul Kagame's Rwanda in the way that it would like. And aside from an anti-Tutsi ideology, it hasn't had much purpose. There are lots of disarmament, demobilization, reintegration programs that have been rolled out for it over the past few years. The problem is that these are extremely poorly funded and don't leave the combatants with a great deal of prospects afterwards. And frankly, a lot more lucrative for the FDLR is the trade in natural resources. It has a lot of so-called artisanal, informal control of gold mines, and it also has a big hand in the charcoal trade out of Virunga National Park, which overall is worth over $2.5 million a year. So there's a lot of money to be made there. It looks, according to our monitoring, it looks like the group has lain fairly low in terms of violence this year, although I did notice a bit of a rise in clashes in December. It had several clashes with the FARDC, and in one of which it lost its chief spokesman to an arrest, whose name is Laforge Vizbaye, and he's, apart from that, their leadership has actually stayed fairly consistent over the years. Though even if they don't prove hugely active in the coming year, their limited activity remains an indirect recruitment boost for another group that operates in that Masisi region called the Nduma Defense of Congo. And they oppose the Fdlr, and there's UN reports saying that their recruits are motivated by anti-Fdlr sentiment. So that's a sort of illustration of how a rebel group's presence has a knock-on effect for further militarization. So crossing over into the west, we see down in the sort of southwestern corner, we can see Kasai province. Now the good news is that the violence in Kasai has greatly decreased over the last year. There's very few clashes associated with the Kamwina and Sapu rebellion, and they were mostly earlier this year. And these days, actually, the Kamwina and Sapu rebellion is most famous for being the group that was, it looks like, framed for the murders of the UN experts Michael Sharp and Zaida Catalan apparently by the Congolese government. It remains to be seen whether or not Kasai region is going to stabilise, and I think that's going to hang very much on what happens over the next 2 weeks in terms of the presidency. If Felix Tshisekedi, current president-elect, get sworn in around about the 22nd, I think that Kasai will probably stabilise, since Tshisekedi is from there, and the rebellion was very much supporting his father before him, and then him as a candidate. And actually on the day that he was named president-elect, 14 among their number did a ceremonial surrender of their weapons in front of his party headquarters. So it remains to be seen what happens there. Finally, we've got the most active rebel group at the moment, and certainly the one that commands the most attention, which is the Allied Democratic Forces. They are believed to be responsible for a number of horrific killings of civilians in and around the city of Beni, which is up in that sort of northwestern corner where you can see a red dot. Sorry, northeastern corner. The main reason that they get a lot of media and policy attention is for an apparent jihadist ideology and their supposed ties to transnational jihadist organisation. To my mind, the question is how influential that jihadist ideology really is on their strategy and their day-to-day operations. There is some evidence that has come to light this year suggesting that the group wants to market itself a little bit more as a jihadist actor. The Congo Research Group released a report last month going over a cache of propaganda videos that look to be mimicries of ISIS-style propaganda videos. And they also reportedly received some funding from a Kenyan national who had also sent money to ISIS. There's a lot of caveats, however, to be made when you're talking about the ADF and radical Islamism. There are lots of attacks attributed to it, but we also know that it's been a scapegoat for a lot of other armed groups' violence, and we know that it has been actually quite willing to partner up, at least in the short term, with other groups that you wouldn't have expected from a group with its professed ideology. It has lived in this area for an extremely long time, so it's very much part and parcel of that militant landscape that's very interlinked. And it's possible that one of the actors it has partnered with is also the Congolese Armed Forces. The other thing I'll say on this is that whilst the militant Islamist component of the ADF gets the most origins. It was actually formed out of a fusion of two groups. So the first was a radical Islamist movement known as the Tablighs, and the other component was an ethnic secessionist movement of the Bakonjo-Banande people who inhabit that northeastern corner and spread between DRC and Uganda. That's a very long story, and I'm happy to talk about it more in Q&A, but I will say that I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that ethnic component to its current activities and strategy. There has been some questioning about whether it's going to try and establish an Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram style proto-state given the lawlessness in Eastern Congo. I am very firmly of the opinion that that's not the case, and I'm happy to talk about that more after the Q&A. But I hope that this goes to show the sort of complex patchwork of rebel objectives that whoever does become the next president is going to have to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. I'd like to change subject a little, because the DRC is also home to one of the largest and longest running UN peacekeeping missions currently active in the world. Andrew, have the peacekeepers made any difference? Is the country more stable now than it was before?
Certainly speaking, in sort of the larger framework of the UN mandate, the UN has had some success, despite the reports that you come across within the news and other sources. The problem with the UN is it's a large mission in the sense of it's the highest number of troops, but over a very large location or country in itself. So the logistical issues, most of DRC isn't developed, and so what you see within this mission is similar to other missions that you have in the African continent, where the UN's capabilities are restricted because it doesn't either have the resources or the actual stretch to get to certain parts of the country. However, largely speaking, one of the things that I've come across within my own research is that the Congolese people, I think, are at the point where they want the UN to leave. And that's because there's a lot of people within the Congo who see the UN as enabling some of the armed groups, but also enabling the government itself. However, that I don't think the UN will wrap up anytime soon. And I've said this before, to wrap up any mission, you need at least 5 to 7 years with an exit strategy. There is no strategy in place. There are no talks of that. And so, if anything, the UN probably will be there for another decade and a half. And this is just purely because even the sort of larger, one, it's a larger contingent, but also the way in which the UN or MONUSCO is set up across the different parts of the country, it becomes very hard to secure peace with the government. And that's something that we saw within 2018, where Kabila pretty much pushed the UN away. And so that sort of interaction that the UN would have had with the president or the state itself has been fragmented. And that's something that would need to be built going forward. The other thing to just mention, which is coming back to Eleanor's point, and something that I mentioned earlier, is that the UN's role when it comes to dealing with the armed groups has been largely okay, could be better, but again, you're dealing with a security apparatus that isn't as strong as most other countries. And so while the UN has worked with the army, the military, different aspects of the state to try and deal with the armed groups, they haven't really been successful, I would say, in trying to deal with all of them. The only real success was the 2018, the earlier missions, but the sort of recent times, they haven't really been able to get a grasp of dealing with the armed groups within the eastern part as well.
Well, talking about UN operations, there is growing concern, especially across the African continent, that sometimes regional operations might actually be more effective than large UN peacekeeping missions. What do you think about it? Do you agree? And also, what do you suggest or recommend local, regional partners and institutions could do to contribute to a resolution in DRC? So
I think what you see within, and I think which is probably going to be the case going forward, is that you'll see more regional blocks coming together to form peacekeeping pacts or missions. We saw that in ECOWAS and it's sort of the western part of Africa. The southern central part and the Horn of Africa doesn't really have that capacity. particularly if you look at sort of the regional bloc around IGAD, SADC. They don't really have the capabilities in the sense of the equipment and training that the ECOWAS member states have. And so that will always play to their disadvantage. The other thing to just mention also is that even if IGAD, for example, was to ever try and launch a UN mission, a mission, peacekeeping mission, it would probably struggle to be able to get that off the ground as well. And that's something that I think if you look at across the sort of continent of Africa, it will be a problem going forward. I think you will see more peacekeeping missions with regional focus, with regional sort of support, but more led by UN UN heads as opposed to sort of regional countries itself. They just don't have the capacity to do that, and we see an example of that from Somalia as well. I mean, it's underfunded compared to other missions and other UN missions that we see around the world.
Thank you. So we've spoken about the political elite, we've spoken about the armed groups, we've spoken about the UN and other partners. How about the people? So what are the humanitarian implications of all this violence and chaos?
Not good. There's going to be several really critical humanitarian challenges that the next administration's going to have to deal with. We've already touched on a few of them, but I think the Ebola crisis deserves a little bit more attention. There have been, since the start of the outbreak, there have been 658 cases as of 2 days ago. These are confirmed cases, and there have been 402 fatalities. Whilst the epicenter of that epidemic is in the Beni area, which is the same city that's hardest hit by the ADF rebellion. The number of new cases in that city are going down. However, number of new cases in other nearby regions, especially Ituri, are going up. So in reality, it's more of a number of different outbreaks rather than a singular outbreak, and each outbreak is going to require its own very localized response. The really difficult fact for humanitarian operations to contend with around Ebola is the massive distrust among Congolese citizens of the Ebola relief efforts. So to give you an example, when I was doing my data entry for the database the other day, I came across a story about a school in Ituri where the children, once they learned that there was an Ebola vaccination team on the way, they fled the classroom because there was a rumour going around that instead of vaccinating you, the vaccine would actually give you the disease. Likewise, when we saw after the presidential election was basically annulled in 3 constituencies, Beni, Butembo and Yombi, we saw in Beni that during the massive demonstrations that broke out after that, 5 health centres specialising in Ebola relief were attacked by demonstrators, including a holding unit, and about 20 patients escaped. 20 people suspected of having Ebola. So there has been a lot of violence, not just from the armed groups, but also from angry citizens that the relief efforts have had to contend with. And that has hugely complicated the efforts. It's forced them to suspend operations for a few days at a time. And I'm no epidemiologist, but it's you can imagine what a few days means when you are countering something as serious as a disease like that. And it's not just the Ebola relief efforts that get hampered by violence. So to give you another example, a couple of weeks ago, a World Food Programme driver was shot when one of their missions was driving down through Masisi province in North Kivu, and that incident suspended or temporarily suspended food distribution to 13,000 internally displaced people. So it is there is a lot of humanitarian aid required, but it is an extremely challenging environment in which to try and deliver it. We have a massive number of internally displaced people in the DRC. There's 4.5 million IDPs currently believed to be in the DRC, and they have their own challenges every day. So it's a huge humanitarian agenda that's going to require a lot of work in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. well, we've covered so much, and I'm sure there will be questions and comments from the floor. We have about 25 minutes, and also from people joining us through the webinar. Please do send us your questions, and we'll read them aloud. So if you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand, and when I call on you, if you could please introduce yourself. Anyone who would like to start? Sir, please.
Lawrence Scott, Transparency International. I've got two questions, if I may, Chair Lady. One,
sure.
Could you say more about the complexity of the election results for the National Assembly? The point was made that the National Assembly is very important, but most of us, I suspect, certainly myself, have not picked up what's the breakdown of the election of deputies vis-a-vis the presidential front-runners and whoever they may be, Tshisekedi and others. And the second question, which nobody's mentioned, is the question of the incredible importance of cobalt, coltan, uranium, etc. And is your prognostication that will be mined by artisans as well as by large companies? And what's going to happen to the conflict between large companies, especially in Katanga, and artisanal mining?
Thank you.
So with the National Assembly, it's when you think of Parliament in the UK here. It's what controls the power base. The President is a figurehead, and I think one of the things that I've tried to emphasise is that even though Kabila is the President, it's the actual cronies or it's the actual elites who run the country itself. And so what you have in the Assembly is over 350 members, from what we can tell, being elected from the FCC. What this means is that the actual control or power of the country will be ruled by the FCC and not by the opposition. So even if there's a recount, or the court says, okay, Martin Fayulu was declared the winner, but held in the National Assembly sticks, it will still mean the actual country is run by the FCC and not by the President. And that's key, because I think Martin Fayulu's party only got in the region of, from what I can tell, around about 50 votes, which is not a high number, which means, again, he's a minority within the actual Assembly itself.
Thank you.
On the mining point?
Yes. You're absolutely right to emphasise the importance of mining, and especially the breakdown of industrial versus artisanal mining. So, as I'm sure many of you know, the DRC produces 2/3 of the world's cobalt, which is an increasingly valuable resource, not least for its use in telecoms, but also because it's a key component in solar panels and in a lot of the green energy technology that we are understandably very keen to develop. However, in terms of the breakdown between industrial and artisanal mining, I had a feeling this question was come up, so I was looking through some figures this morning. The most detailed study I could find was from 2016, which I believe said that about 20% of cobalt was extracted by artisanal miners. That's a very hard thing to pinpoint for sure, and the conditions in which artisanal miners work are obviously extremely dangerous. They're exposed to toxic mineral dust, they have to operate in extremely dangerous conditions without regulatory equipment, and so on and so forth, and then they sell the cobalt that they extract to so-called buying houses, which are I believe mostly run by Chinese traders, and the prices that they are offered are more or less non-negotiable. That study also said that out of the proportion of the country's mines that of the known artisanal mines that they visited, 25% were controlled by non-state armed groups, and 27% were presided over by members of the Congolese armed forces, and with all of that, 27% was obviously interfering with that supply chain. So it's not just the armed groups who are involved in illegal exploitation. Excuse me. And just a quick note on the side of that, there's been all sorts of regulatory frameworks put forward to try and clean up that supply chain. That's a very hard thing to do for cobalt. There's because it's such big business these days, so many artisanal miners depend on it, and so it's not strictly speaking a conflict mineral. Actually, rebel groups are much more heavily involved in the gold trade than they are in the cobalt trade. Now, that may change, particularly since the price of cobalt has risen a great deal over the past couple of years, and in December the Congolese government tripled royalties on so-called strategic minerals, of which cobalt is the most valuable. So the price is going to go up, and obviously that's going to open up much more opportunity for illicit trading. I'm afraid your guess is as good as mine when it comes to Katanga specifically. I think that there's an awful lot of history there, and secessionist sympathies never really, they fade, but they never really leave. I couldn't pretend to tell you, I couldn't pretend to give you a prediction as to how minerals are going to affect that in future, but they're certainly going to be a critical factor all over the country, and the DRC is going to grow as a whole in global strategic importance as cobalt gets harder and harder to find.
Thank you. Please, the gentleman at the very back.
Charles Ashford, UK maybe. May I ask your opinion on great power influence in DRC? Probably split into two areas, one being on the political side and security, and then the other side just being their open disregard of all of that and then rampant activity in DRC.
Sorry,
it's a question on great power influence in the DRC. And what was the second half of the question?
So whether it's on the political and security side or on the sort of resource side?
Yes. Thank you. You go first.
I think the political side is probably much stronger than the sort of security and military side. I mean, that being said, Kabila does have control of the police, but not really the army. I mean, we've discussed this at quite length and debated and disagreed and agreed and gone back over it again. I think going forward, as I said earlier, I think the elites are the key here, because they really are the ones who control the National Assembly, but the whole entire institutional system within the DRC. I don't see that changing anytime soon. Certainly the figures that I've spoken to who are in senior leadership within the DRC have said this pretty much the same thing. And even if the situation in DRC, my third scenario actually happens, what I think will happen is that the FCC will consolidate more of the power. And so, in essence, that bloc, or the political bloc, will continue to be the strongest. The military, I think it's always hit and miss, particularly because what you see in the DRC is that oftentimes people will use the military as a way of financing, resources, financing themselves, and so I see that rising if things continue the way or continue in the same path that they are now. But I don't think that will be larger than the political sort of dynamic or layer to it.
Cool. Thanks very much. The only things, a couple of things that I would add to that, though I'm very much on board with Andrew's analysis. I think that Russia and China have found a way to found a niche in the UN Security Council that they can play very well with post-colonial African states, in that they can play the sovereignty card in a way. They can appeal to African governments on the grounds of respect for sovereignty above all else, and in exchange for that leverage quite advantageous positions within those administrations. To come back to the question of resources, I think resources are going to be crucial, particularly cobalt, in how great powers deal with DRC in the future. We've had geopolitics hang on resources before. I don't want to do anything silly like compare cobalt to oil, but at the same time we can't underestimate that mineral's importance in our present tech economy. So I think that you are going to get very heightened geostrategic competition there, and at the moment it does seem to be cleaved quite neatly down the UN Security Council between a Russia and China bloc, with South Africa supporting them, and then the Western side on the other.
Thank you. Please.
Jordan Anderson from IISS James. I wanted to ask two questions, if I may. One, I just wanted to ask, so were you saying that the deal with Sani to announce a Tshisekedi victory instead of a Shadari victory, was that struck before the 30th of December, or you didn't think it was important?
So according to a senior source that I've spoken to, that deal, the reason why the elections was actually pushed back was because that deal was taking place. And so while everyone thought the Sini was saying, it's one thing, actually, behind closed door, these guys were actually negotiating. And that's from a senior figure that I know within the FCC.
But they didn't even wait for Shadari's vote to tank. They did vote, right? And second, I was just wondering, how do you see the Angolan reaction to all the election results coming out of Kinshasa?
I think with all of these things, it's difficult to say. To a degree, it's expected, but also a little bit unexpected. I don't know how to answer that really. What would you say?
I think that a lot of what's going to happen next is going to hang in what the SADC and AU observers say, and I don't think that, I'm no expert on Angola, I don't think Angola will act completely unilaterally outside of those bodies, but I wouldn't elaborate too much on that for fear of being wrong, because every prediction we make these days seems to be subject to revisions by next day.
Just one point that I wanted to touch on, which is I think a lot of people have missed, and I mentioned earlier, but it's the sort of Article 76 of the Constitution, and so that's, I think, for me, key going forward. If there is violence and there is no elected official, Kabila will remain in power, and I think that's something that the international community needs to pay attention to, because it's something that is understated and oftentimes people don't look and recognise, but it is in the Constitution, particularly Article 76, but also Article 70, which was used in 2016, and it's likely that it will be used again for him to remain in power.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Christina Lamb from the Sunday Times. A few years ago, DRC was described as the rape capital of the world. Is that something that's still happening on a large scale?
Yes, very much. It's an issue that's obviously come to light a great deal next year, thanks to the very well-deserved prize-winning, the very well-deserved award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Dr. Denis Mukwege. I'm afraid I don't have any statistics on hand to give you, but I do know that there are several rebel groups that have been under the eye of both international and indeed national observers for their continued conduct of sexual violence. One in particular is the Nduma Defense of Congo, but I'm sure that they're not the only ones who are guilty of that. It is still, sadly, all too common.
Thank you. Anyone else? Please.
Hi, Felix Tshisekedi from Fdlr. I'm just wondering, with regards to the international community's response to the elections with France and Belgium, for example, suggesting that the results were fraudulent and kind of supporting what was being said by the ILU and the Catholic Church, do you see there being any kind of escalation of international response in terms of assuming that the Constitutional Court rules against the challenge? Do these international criticisms kind of melt away, or do you see further sanctions in response to electoral fraud?
Short answer is no. I think what will happen is the international community will have to support it pretty much out of fear that things could escalate out of control. Similar to what you see in Sudan, even though Bashir has been there for many years and people want him out and they don't like him, the reality is if you remove him, there's a massive void that you leave there. And it's similar, it's the same pattern that you see here. I think even though it's telling that France and Belgium have sort of come out and said what they've said, I don't think the AU or SADC have the capacity regionally to be able to control or to force the FCC or Kabila out. And so what I see is, to a degree, just a compromise to say, actually, let's go along with this. This is what it is. It won't change, and that's why I think the sort of SADC's talk of a government of national unity is really one that really doesn't really work in the DRC, because in essence you're trying to say a coalition that didn't stick should try and stick. I mean, how does that work? So I don't see that change from an international perspective. I think what will need to happen is that there will need to be more support towards putting pressure on the elites within DRC.
Can I just add a little bit to that? I broadly agree with Andrew. I think that the likely height of the response to this might be further sanctions. President Trump is a fond user of sanctions, and the EU certainly already have a few in place, not least against the FCC's candidate Emmanuel Ramazani Shadari. There may be some more of those, though I would anticipate that they would target. They would certainly be targeting individuals, and probably individuals who wouldn't hugely affect the country's dealings with DRC in the future, again because of the resources question and all sorts. I would imagine that it may escalate further, but probably not very far.
So,
Rob Millard, a member of the Institute. Do you have any current information on the Virunga National Park on the Rwandan border? It was closed late last year after the abduction of some British tourists. So I'm just interested to know what the current security status is.
As I understand it, I'm afraid I can't give you an exact answer on what the current security status officially of the park is. As I understand it, they usually have partial, or they quite often have partial relaxations of the rules, and that may be contingent on which tour companies are operating. I'm not certain, but I got the impression in the past that there were periodic relaxations of the rules for certain areas of the park that were known to be safe.
This is in the last month or two since the formal closure.
I'm sorry?
In the last couple of months since the formal closure after the abductions?
I couldn't tell you the exact status, I'm afraid. I haven't. Probably your guess is as good as mine.
Thank you.
James Redcliffe, member of the Institute. I was in the military in Monarch in Congo a few years ago, but I think what is quite interesting is always the West's interest in stability in Uganda and Rwanda. And there's no, it's well known that a lot of the armed groups are just across the border in Congo. It'd be interesting to know what your view is of the new President and the new National Assembly, their relationship with Uganda and Rwanda, and whether the new President can do business with them. Kabila has a very difficult relationship with them. Can that improve? And do you think there needs to be greater pressure put in the Great Lakes region to bring stability?
It would be a wonderful thing if there was more pressure to increase stability within the Great Lakes region. I think that there are so many competing interests that that pressure is going to be fairly limited for the foreseeable future. To my knowledge, I think it remains to be seen whoever does become the next president. I think that their relation, at a guess, I would imagine that Martin Fayulu might have a stronger pre-existing connection to those nations. I know that one of his supporters, Mbusa Nyamwisi, who's the head of RCDK, he likes to advertise quite close links to the Ugandan government, and he's certainly been supporting Martin Fayulu. So I imagine he, alongside various other lobbyists, have probably been doing their time in Kampala and in Kigali to sell their candidate of choice. There's no reason to say that Tshisekedi hasn't been doing the same. I think that relationship remains to be forged, and time will tell.
You are really telling us that you don't think that Tshisekedi has got the job, because all the indications are
that he has.
He's in, and we know from other elections that there will be a sort of massaging of the. Is there any likelihood of any other one of the candidates or being appointed? It does seem very unlikely.
No, I mean, I don't think it will happen. As I say, I think the Constitutional Court will throw out the appeal, and I think based on, for example, the boycott they'll state other reasons, but I think they'll state the boycott as being one of the reasons. They will also look at sort of the Martin Fayulu's acts on saying actually people shouldn't vote and actually rule in favour of Tshisekedi. I can't see that being the opposite way. But again, this is, we sort of played out the scenarios earlier on in the year, and then it changed. But the way things are now, I think it's highly likely that yes, he will be the president. I can't see that being any way. I mean, even again, if he isn't, Martin Fayulu does win the presidency, which again is highly unlikely, he won't control the actual state. It will be the FCC.
Just to add to that very briefly, I think that yesterday I would have 100% agreed with you that it was highly unlikely that Tshisekedi was going to cement it. Today, I still broadly agree with you. The only thing that might make the difference is the data leak that the Financial Times and various other news outlets published with the compilation of the results from the voting machines, which made very clear that the results were extremely irregular and that in fact Martin Fayulu was the real winner, assuming those results are authentic, which I think so far evidence suggests that they are. I don't think that that's necessarily going to rock the boat too much. A lot of that depends on how SADC and the AU respond. They're holding emergency meetings today, so we don't know. I agree that it's highly unlikely, but then a lot of highly unlikely things have happened over the last couple of weeks, so I wouldn't want to make a cemented prediction just yet.
Cool. Thank you. Final question.
If Felix Tshisekedi does become president, does that mean that Kabila is really running everything, or might he be his own?
Well, it would still be the FCC, so the FCC would hold a majority within the House. And I think what we have to be careful of is within Congolese politics, it's not really, I mean, Kabila does control the House in the sense of he is the figurehead, but it's actually the FCC are the ones who control the National Assembly, and that's going to be key. Even if Tshisekedi does become president, it will still be run by the FCC. They would hold a majority. They will be the ones, if anything, potentially bring in other members from Felix Tshisekedi's party within the FCC to hold that block as well. So I don't see that changing anytime soon. That is for me a definite thing. When I speak to the senior officials in DRC, that's all. That is pretty much what they're saying. The FCC will try to incorporate or sort of merge sort of the power base and control that house more and more.
Okay. Thank you. I'm afraid this is all we have time for. Before we leave, I have a couple of announcements. The first one is that our colleague Rob Hopgood is here in the room, and for those of you who are interested, he'll be running demonstrations of our armed conflict database. So if you want to look into the data underpinning the briefing and also the entire conflict briefing series, you can do that next door in the Temple room.
And that's in the council room.
Council room, yeah. Apologies. And also the next briefings will be on South Sudan on the 19th of February, on Nigeria on the 28th of February, and on Libya on the 19th of March. So I very much hope you enjoyed the briefing, and I certainly got loads out of it. So thank you guys. Thank you also for the people who join us remotely. So thank you again.